All right, greetings from the Dark Continent. Conscious Caracal here, or Arends van Sail, here to shine a light on not particularly South Africa this time around specifically, but more the world of diplomacy, seeing as we seem to have an ample amount of diplomacy experts out there at the moment in the South African commentator sphere, seeing after the whole debacle and diplomatic crisis unleashed by our ambassador to the United States. So I thought it would be fruitful to have a conversation with an ex-diplomat that I happen to have on my contact list, ex-diplomat that I've had the pleasure of meeting in person at NatCon in the United States, but we've been mutuals on X for a long time before that. I'm, of course, talking about Alberto Fernandez. He is a former US diplomat, and he's going to help me illuminate some of the misconceptions some people might have around what does it really mean to be a diplomat in his experience. Alberto, welcome on the show. I've just been looking for an excuse to get a nice topic that we can have a discussion on. I've been planning to have you on as a guest for a long time, and I think the current diplomatic crisis surrounding South Africa and the Trump administration is the perfect excuse.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be on with you. Yeah, I've been watching this diplomatic debacle with the South African ambassador with great amusement and, some sadness, of course, but it's a fascinating situation. But happy to be on talking to you.
And I wanted to start off with a very basic question, almost like a political science 101, seeing as I said in the intro, there's so many people now that are out there, armchair experts on international diplomacy and what diplomats are supposed to and not supposed to do. But as someone that has been saturated in this world of international diplomacy, can you just give the brief summary of what are the responsibilities of a diplomat today?
Well, the basic responsibility of a diplomat is to make representations. In other words, to represent your country before another country and to try to influence that country for the sake of your own nation. The old definition back in the 1600s, Sir Henry Wotton, who was the UK's, Great Britain's ambassador to Venice, that famous line, an ambassador is an honest man sent to lie for his country. There's an element of truth to that, not in the sense of lying, but in the sense that you are both representing yourself, your nation, and seeking to influence the other. So there's a real element in diplomacy of understanding, comprehending the other. One of the dangers that you have in diplomacy, for example, we talk about it, we Americans talk about it, is going native, which means you go to country X and you like country X more than your own country, and you sit and you say, yeah, those Americans, they're terrible, and you're American, right? That's the wrong way to do it. The right way, though, is to understand the country you're going to, hopefully deeply, hopefully in a multi-layered, nuanced way, and to understand what your own goals are and how to accomplish them. I mean, I recall when I was head of our embassy, U.S. Embassy in Sudan is a perfect example. Sudan is a country, when I was there, a hostile regime, the Bashir dictatorship, Islamist regime. They just signed a peace treaty with the South, so there was a national unity government. A regime that had done lots of bad things. And so I had to talk kind of a hard line with them, but they knew that I liked Sudan, that I liked the Sudanese people, that I was interested in the country, that I spoke their language. And so I went out of my way to officially say what the U.S. government wanted, which was often hard, but to also find ways to build bridges with the regime. So I went out of my way to, meet every regime official I could, no matter how notorious, the Janjaweed, who, today we have the civil war in Sudan. At that time, they were being used. These are killers being used by the regime to commit human rights abuses, but there were no American sanctions on them. I wanted to know what these people were thinking. I wanted to understand them. At the same time, when it came to delivering policy points, I was tough with the regime. That's why I don't understand the Ambassador Rasul thing. Is because it violates the first basic rule of diplomacy. You can think whatever you want about the other, right? Whatever he said, and it's terrible stuff that he said, but whatever, he can think that. There's nothing wrong with him thinking that. He may be wrong, but there's nothing wrong with him believing certain things. But to say it in that way is it's not smart diplomacy. First of all, we live in a world where there used to be kind of two narratives, right? We say some things to our own people, we say some things to the outside world. You see this, for example, where I work in the Arab world. You see that a lot, where dictators, and Yasser Arafat was famous for this. He would say one thing in Arabic and one thing in English. And you could get away with it back in the day. Guess what? You can't get away with it anymore. And you can't get away with talking to a think tank in Johannesburg and thinking that people in the United States are not going to notice what you're saying. That's arrogance. That's just not smart diplomacy, So if he had been smart, I don't know the man, he would have been building bridges with the people most hostile to South Africa and the United States, not those least hostile to the United States. You would have been seeking to kind of build some kind of bridge. It doesn't mean you have to like them. It doesn't mean you have to believe them, with those who are your biggest critics. That's, like I said, that's a kind of basic rule of diplomacy, which this man had been a diplomat before. In fact, he'd been in the United States before, but he just didn't know. Of course, the other problem is America in 2015 and America in 2025 are two very different places.
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant point. The fact that when he served his first term there in the United States, the Trump era had not arrived yet. But now we're firmly...
It hadn't even started yet. So
and
the
now we're
Republican
firmly in
Party
it.
of 2015 is not the Republican Party of today.
Absolutely. And I think the other point in regards to diplomacy is that when there is already an unfolding crisis surrounding you, your first instinct as a diplomat is to then address that crisis, to try and resolve it, to try and put out fires, not throw more petrol on those fires.
Yes, the State Department spokeswoman, I think she said it well, I think yesterday, because it's not one thing. You want to build, as a nation, you want to build a narrative to the other, right, to the country you're representing, that is nuanced. So you don't want them to see you as, boy, these people are terrible. We hate everything about them. Everything we know about them is awful, right? There's a narrative that is built about nations, especially larger nations, over time, which can be very destructive or very positive, right? The United Kingdom, for example, has benefited for a very long time because of America's kind of love-hate, but more love of Britain, of Churchill, of, empire, of the royals, of all of that. Today, we see that there's a kind of a gap developing between Americans who say, well, the UK is actually not the UK of Churchill, not the UK that we admired. That's a problem. In South Africa, Americans, if they think about South Africa, they think about apartheid and Mandela. And okay, but then other stuff starts coming afterwards, which kind of makes the figure, the image look darker. That's what the spokeswoman mentioned yesterday. She mentioned the land appropriation bill. She mentioned, the Hamas relationship. She mentioned the coziness of with Russia and China. I would add on top of that, kind of a lot of self goals, this kill the Boer thing. Why would you do that? Why you want to be known about this way? And you have positives in South Africa, which I don't know how you screw up. For example, the richest man in the world is from South Africa. I would think a smart politician in the ANC, and I don't know much about South Africa, modern South Africa, would think, how do we turn that reality into either a favorable for us or a neutral thing for us, right? But certainly not a negative, right? I mean, that would be true across the board. You want to present the other, in this case, the Americans, with a nuanced view of you. You don't want them to think, oh, these guys are all bad. Look how terrible these people are. You want them to think of, you could even say a romanticized view, a not entirely accurate view, right? Of ourselves, So that's, I think, a challenge. Smart politicians are not necessarily smart diplomats sometimes.
And it's just the most massive misstep where you mentioned Elon Musk now, but if you take Elon Musk and Donald Trump and you look how they've been treated by the South African government rhetorically and policy-wise, you are turning the two most powerful and popular figures within America today into your enemy. Specifically with Elon Musk, where there was a slam dunk opportunity, as you mentioned there, to build a relationship, build a bridge there. But now the South African government is blocking Starlink in South Africa because Elon Musk's SpaceX does not meet their race criteria, even to the point where Elon has come out in public saying, this is ridiculous, look what they are doing to me. It's exactly the opposite of what you're describing there as what they should be doing. They're doing the opposite, which made me ask the question the other day that if you look at the actions of ANC officials abroad for the past, not just few months, but for a long time, or for many years now, you can't help but interpret what they're doing as almost a willing sabotage of South Africa's interests. They keep insulting the host nations where their officials are stationed. They keep attacking our largest trading partners, but for no visible benefits except to grandstand and walk around as a cock of the walk, as if they are the big tough guy on the international stage. I just see this image in my mind's eye of this tiny little boy running up to the biggest boy on the entire playground, kicking him in the shin, and then like standing there pretending to be tough. And then when he gets when the chickens come home to roost and he gets a response, then he cries foul and says, well, what's going on here? Why am I being treated this way? I will not be bullied, in their words.
Yeah. I think what happens is I've seen many governments in diplomacy, regimes, sometimes very bad regimes that are good at diplomacy because they understand the reality. They don't have blinkers on. They understand the reality of the situation, and they know how to maneuver. They know how to manipulate. They're cynical in a way. I wonder, and again, I wonder if the part of the problem is that the ANC are prisoners of their own ideology. Because they've drunk their own Kool-Aid, and they also think that it's 1990s and Mandela and everybody loves us and we don't have to do anything, right? Because we're so obviously so great and everything is obviously so good, and the world moves, and the reality is the world moves on. I think successful diplomacy is when there's maybe a little bit of cynicism in a government or a regime that realizes we have to work at it. For example, this campaign with you guys with AfriForum to me makes no sense. It's illogical. The fact that there is dissidence and disagreement in South Africa is actually a good thing. So a campaign against you guys, for example, is a way of reinforcing all the negative things that we already talked about. It's like pouring more oil on the fire. Makes no sense. On the contrary, you would say, look at how free we are. We have this, and we have critics, and we have this great political space, and blah, 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 even if that's not true, right? That's what you see in actually countries that are actually open dictatorships, that they kind of play this game. They play this game of look at, we're actually not so awful. And sometimes they're presenting things which are maybe not well known. Other times, of course, they're lying. It's a type of dishonesty. But you have to work at diplomacy, and you have to work to kind of engage the other and find ways to engage, especially those that are your biggest critics. When I was in the government, when I was in the State Department, in the state, we have different areas of specialization, right? So there are political officers, there are economic officers, there are consular officers who do, visas and stuff. There are administrative officers who run the embassy. And there's the fifth, what we call fifth cone, which is called public diplomacy. I was a public diplomacy officer. What does that mean? It means that I worked with the press, with the cultural institutions, with universities, try to influence them in the service of my country. So public opinion, I would go into a country and I would look at, who are the opinion makers here? Who are the columnists that people read? Who are the people that are influential in the government ideologically? And I would try to build bridges to those people. Now, it doesn't mean that I like these people. In many cases, depending on the country, there were people I didn't like. But that didn't matter. What mattered is for me to have an avenue to talk to them, to try to influence them. It doesn't mean that I made anti-American columnists pro-American. But the goal was to make an anti-American columnist 20% less anti-American, or 50% less anti-American. So in the context of South Africa, you would reach out to the biggest critics and try to make them a little less anti-South African, right? Anti-South African government. So public diplomacy is something that people forget. We all do public diplomacy. When you say kill the Boer, that is public diplomacy. That's negative public diplomacy. That's toxic public diplomacy, right? There are other things that you do which are positive public diplomacy. And so governments that are well run, that understand the world well, look for ways to kind of enhancing their brand. How can I make my brand better? How can I, for example, if I have a specific kind of ideological coloring, how do I make that more nuanced so people don't see me as kind of in this black and white, very, very hostile way? They see, well, I don't like this about that country, but I like that about that country. So you have to work at it. And I think with South Africa, the government anyway, there's a danger of kind of resting on the laurels of the past and listening to the people that are going to tell you what you want to hear. And I'm not talking about South Africans, I'm talking about foreigners. You can be a diplomat. With all respect, I used to see this in diplomacy with the Europeans. Often the Europeans, the EU diplomats especially, they were very comfortable overseas. They were very kind of in a bubble. They didn't exert themselves very much. They weren't very interested in understanding the situation that they were in. That's not so good. You have to work at it. You have to be understanding the society that you're in, How do you influence it? How do you advance your country's goals in country X? And it's not going to be by virtue signaling. I'm so great. You're so bad. You're a racist. Oh, woe is me. That's not going to work. It may work in a closed system where you say you control the media and people are telling you what you want to hear and you're telling them what you want to hear. But if you go outside of that closed system, then you're in the real world. You have to deal with people who actually disagree with you. You have to figure out how to sit down with people who disagree with you and talk to them.
About Alberto, I actually want to, on that note, you've mentioned some good advice now, that potential advice for the South African government if they are at all interested in defusing the situation. But I want to put a hypothetical to you. If you were to be in that position where you were tasked with advising the South African government through this diplomatic crisis, you've mentioned now some of the advice already, building bridges with your biggest critics. But specifically with the Trump administration, I know you're not working for the Trump administration, but you keep a very close eye on how they negotiate. You know Trump as a political figure very well.
Yeah.
If you were now hypothetically the advisor to the South African government, what would you tell them about, firstly, how do you defuse the situation? And then how do you defuse the situation based specifically on what you're dealing with, regards to how Trump negotiates and how you'll be able to actually get a positive out of this rather than a negative in regards to the best interests of South Africa?
Well, I think two things. I would say on the macro and on the micro. On the macro level, countries have to decide what their priorities are, right? And what are the significant things? And I can't say that for the South African government. I actually don't know. What are the most important things for them when it comes to a relationship with the United States? What is it that they most want to keep? And what is most that they want to get? This is, of course, this transactional diplomacy, transactional politics. President Trump is very transactional, but you should also be transactional. You know, all this we've mentioned half a dozen irritants, right? Some of those irritants, they may be irritants to the Americans. Some of them may be essential things for the state in South Africa. You know. Flogging for Hamas, you know, is the most important thing for South Africa. If that is the case, as we say in Arabic, tafaddalu, go ahead, knock yourself out, right? But if it's not, identify what those things are that you care most about, right? And those are the things you want to work on, and you need to find ways to either play down or diffuse or eliminate those other things. Maybe you can't eliminate them completely, but if you have irritants, you have to kind of play down the irritants, and you want to double down on the things that are really essential for your country. You know, what is really valuable for me? Because you're not going to get everything in transactions.
At the moment, they're doubling down on everything.
That's Frederick the Great said, he who defends everything defends nothing, right? That's a problem. And then on the micro level, as I mentioned this a little bit, you need a person or persons who are people person. And there's no one way of doing it. There are many different ways you can do it. There's not like, I'm not going to say pick this or pick that, right? But there are many, when you talk about the Trump administration and you talk about the U.S. and the Republicans who are in power right now, there are many ways you could go. I'll give you certain examples, and these are not, I'm not suggesting you follow them, but I'm just saying these are examples. You could pick a person or persons who is a sincere, humble, good Christian man or woman. That's their thing, right? That's their persona. You could go in the way of picking a person who is a cynical, clever political operator, a wheeler and dealer. You notice those two things are not the same thing. They're very different things, right? So there's not one way of addressing kind of dealing with the other, right? I mentioned two there: the sincere Christian, the clever cynic, right? I could think of 4 or 5 or 6 different kind of variations on that. The person who knows America really well, who truly knows America really well, America right now, maybe you should name Elon Musk ambassador to the United States.
Yeah, I wish if I was the script writer, that's what I would do.
But anyway, as you can see, that's what they need to do. They need to realize the environment they're in, what is most important for them. That is what they need to prioritize, right? If it's trade, if it's, God forbid, if it's the expropriation bill, right? Okay, that's what you care about most of the world, like Hamas. That's what you care about most of the world. Go ahead. But realize what is important and what is not important, how you're seen by the other. The Americans see you and they think, what the heck is going on in South Africa? This is a country that seemed like to be advancing, moving ahead, Rainbow Nation, all this stuff. And now it seems like it's going down the drain. There's something going on here, which is not good. And then on the micro level, as I said, pick someone who is smart in one way or another, who can speak to at least some element of the Trump coalition. Could be a religious person, could be a political person, could be a smart businessman, a wheeling, dealing businessman. That's another example. So I think there's a lot, despite the kind of dire picture that we've painted, there's a lot that actually governments, including the South African government, can do to engage with the Americans. It's not, the United States is not, and the Trump administration is not a monolithic institution. There's a lot of openness. The American character is to be open. So there's a lot of opportunity to engage with this administration. And it's a lost opportunity that you don't have a person on the ground who can do that right now.
And now that you mention it as well, I was talking to one of my colleagues the other day, and how I see it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's been multiple threats and actions from the Trump administration over the past 5 weeks towards South Africa. But every action and every threat contains within it an implicit and subtle almost invite to come to the negotiating table. And when that invite is rejected, then the punishment follows. But then there's always, again, an implicit invite. Are you willing to come to the negotiating table now? And then when that invite again is rejected, another punishment follows. You see this pattern almost developing from the first Truth Social post from Donald Trump, where it's only a threat. Then you get the actual repercussion, which is the signing of the executive order. Then you get, again, threatening rhetoric, but again, the implicit invite of come to the negotiating table and we can stop this. Then there's the rejection of that from the South African government. Then you get Marco Rubio announcing that he will not attend the preliminary meetings regarding the G20. And then there's again an implicit, but will you come to the negotiating table now? I'm seeing a clear pattern, but maybe I'm misreading the situation. Does that sound accurate to you, Alberto?
Well, it does. And not only that, it's not a South Africa thing. It's the way the administration is doing foreign policy. Trump has this persona, right? He's a larger than life figure. A lot of people like that. A lot of people dislike that, right? But there are some constants in what he is trying to do, not in South Africa, everywhere. Number one, he is a peacemaker. He wants, actually, he's not, he's an aggressive person, but actually he does not want an aggressive foreign policy in the sense of violence, of war, of all of that. He sees that the United States over the past 20 years has overinvested in war and interfering in in the affairs of other nations and all of this. So that's a sincere view that he has, and you see that in Ukraine, you see that in the Middle East. I mean, he sent a letter to the Iranians wanting to make peace with them. So that's number one. He's a peacemaker. Number two, he's a businessman. He's a deal maker. He's looking for mutually beneficial arrangements. You know, the Chinese, communist Chinese, they have their own propaganda, and they use these catchphrases, you know, in their propaganda. One of them is, "We seek win-win scenarios." You know, Trump wants a win-win scenario. So you need to take him at his word and engage and figure out what your win is and what their win is. That's what you need to do.
Yeah, and it's, as I said, it's very clear that from the beginning, the invitation has always been there to come make a deal, but you have to come to him. He's not going to come to you. That's very implicit in all the stances from the Trump administration. Alberto, before we continue, I just want to read 2 comments here from the live chat that I wanted to highlight. The one is from Odin Moja, one of my good friends living there in Florida, from Pretoria. And he says, "Florida man checking in, love the Gadsden flag in the background." I also told Alberto off air that I like the flag there. What is the one next to that, Alberto? It's a bit
that's
folded.
a very interesting question. The Gadsden flag, of course, early American flag invented by Christopher Gadsden of South Carolina. "Don't tread on me" with the rattlesnake. The other one is the Cross of Burgundy. It is from Burgundy, in a country that no longer exists in Europe, but it became the flag of the Spanish Empire. So for hundreds of years, from the discovery of the New World until the late 18th century, it was the flag of Spain, of imperial Spain. But this is why I obviously I'm of Cuban origin, so I trace my ancestry back to Spain. But it also became the basis for the flag of Florida, and by the way, the flag of Alabama, both of which are, you know, it's the St. Andrew's cross. It's a variation of that, but it comes from the kingdom or the Duchy of Burgundy of Charles V, Charles the First of Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was born in Ghent, what is now Belgium, but became, King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, and he's identified with the Spanish Empire, but left this basis in it is the state of Florida. So the state of Florida has the same with this symbol of Florida in the middle.
Fantastic. And then the other comment that I wanted to highlight was from Ronaldo Gous, who says, "I'm convinced that the ANC has decided that the only way to find a new scapegoat for their failures is to get sanctioned by the United States." Well, that's it worked for the Robert Mugabe regime. They convinced a lot of people that that Zimbabwe was destroyed by sanctions, even though those sanctions only targeted specific ZANU PF politicians and not the country as a whole. But that's another story for another day. Maybe you're right. Maybe the ANC are seeing a similar angle for them. It's not going to work though. Alberto, I wanted to ask you also specifically, before we get to, I want to also get into a little bit of your experience, just like where in the world you've been. But I have one last question about the current event that we're talking about, the diplomatic crisis between the South African government and the Trump administration. And it's a headline actually that I saw this morning, and I thought, well, this is actually a perfect question for my guest later today, because you'll know better than me. So the headline is from a South African newspaper that says, "Absurd and undiplomatic, Rasool's expulsion violates global conventions, says experts." But the article is behind a paywall, so I can't really tell you which conventions are being violated. But just based on that headline, the expulsion of South Africa's ambassador from South Africa, to your knowledge, was it according to protocol, or were there international norms and standards that were being violated here?
Absolutely. It is absolutely 100% normal diplomatic practice. When a person is named a diplomat and an ambassador to a country, that country they use the old French word because French used to be the language of diplomacy. The receiving country gives agrément, agreement, We agree to accept Ambassador Rasool as your ambassador to our country. That agreement can be withdrawn at any time, excuse me, for no reason. In other words, they could have expelled him without even giving a reason. That's the diplomatic convention. Um, uh, you know, you often get expelled for political reasons. You're declared a persona non grata. You're a person who is not welcomed, you know. But that is diplomacy. And I've seen it happen many times. I've seen Americans expelled. I've seen us expel people. Sometimes it's espionage, but other times it's because of open political reasons. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with what the Americans did. It is absolutely a tried and tested diplomatic practice from time immemorial. So whoever's saying that they're playing games, they actually have no idea what they're talking about. You should look at the Vienna Convention. And governments have a very broad rights to accept or reject foreign diplomats coming to their country.
So there's no procedure that was broken here in regard, because now that you mentioned the Vienna Convention, that's specifically what's being referenced by these experts here. They're saying that this was a very clear breach of what is outlined within that convention.
No, because there's the reason for expelling someone is anything you want. So I mentioned espionage, right? That's one that is often used, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be anything or nothing. We don't like you, and we're going to ask you to leave. Send somebody else. That's it.
I mean, we've seen a lot of examples very recently, or in recent years as well, where just the actions of the host country of where the ambassador comes from, the actions insult or something that the nation that expelled the ambassador did not like to see. So they expel the ambassador as almost a retaliatory stance or against the actions of his host country, not even anything to do with what the ambassador himself did or said.
Yes. I have a good friend of mine who was the last U.S. ambassador to Venezuela, and he was very well liked. And he was expelled by the Venezuelan government because they were angry at I think it was the Obama administration, right? They liked him. And in fact, they called him in and said, "We like you. It's nothing personal. You're out of here." And there hasn't been, to this day, another resident U.S. ambassador in Venezuela. And by the way, we've been talking about Americans. I served in many hostile countries, and I was never expelled. But there were people who called for my expulsion, not in the government. Usually it was like pro-government media. Does that sound familiar?
Right.
And what would they say? What had Fernandez done? They said Fernandez should be expelled because he is interfering in the internal affairs of our country. You could say that Rasool was interfering in the internal affairs of our country. And by the way, that accusation, that was used in Africa against me, in Sudan. Now, the government said, we don't care what this it was a newspaper allied to the regime, but they were, it was not a big. I never said anything as bad as what the South African ambassador said. But just to show you, you can be expelled under the rubric of interference in our internal affairs or saying something we didn't like. That's not at all uncommon. And as I said, that's why anyone who would say that this is beyond the pale or wrong has no idea. This happens all the time, and there are all kinds of situations where people are expelled for a variety of reasons.
Right. And then my final question that I wanted to ask before we get to your experience, just your experience in the past as a diplomat, is regarding the title of our conversation. So I decided to title our conversation "The Decentralization of Diplomacy," which I think is what we're seeing in the 21st century. Increasingly, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, individuals even, as we see with many online personalities today, are conducting forms of diplomacy in regard that affect their country. And there's nothing illegal about it or treasonous about it or strange about it. But I wanted to hear from you specifically in regards to this phenomenon. Am I right to say that the trend is trending towards decentralization when it comes to diplomacy, as opposed to increased centralization?
Yes, and we live in a world where everyone does diplomacy and everyone does public diplomacy. So the old part of it is the technology, and not just like the internet, the cell phone. You're somebody in Washington is able to get in touch with you immediately. So a diplomat on the ground no longer has the kind of the great flexibility that they used to have in days when the communications were less good, right? So that was the first step. Add on top of that all the newest ways that communications work, that people communicate, social media, the globalization, the world getting smaller. As I said near the beginning, it used to be you could say one thing at home and one thing overseas. That doesn't work anymore. So everyone is doing diplomacy. Everyone is on trial, as it were. Everyone is under a microscope, as it were. That has indeed decentralized diplomacy and kind of weakened traditional diplomacy. That's just the way the world works. I was very happy, and sometimes in Africa, especially where I served, but also in the Middle East, that sometimes communications didn't work. And so Washington couldn't get a hold of me immediately. I had an extra day to do something before they could say, did you do this already? Or what about this? I was able to find something out before they, were beating down my door about this or that.
So the example then of the solidarity movement and AfriForum sending a delegation to the United States to, firstly, I mean, Donald Trump in his executive order and in his rhetoric mentioned Afrikaner specifically, so it's almost only natural that then the largest organizations representing Afrikaners in South Africa make such a trip to the United States to state our case. But then also in regards to our stance, there's so much genuine misinformation out there, not the misinformation that the media has been screaming about, actual misinformation about South Africa. And our delegation went to make sure that the Trump administration has the right information there. But in regards to particularly that type of phenomenon, large civil society organizations like AfriForum sending a delegation, we were once again accused of breaking protocol, doing something that's irrational, abnormal. What are your thoughts on those types of accusations?
What you did, kind of going and expressing your views about the reality in your country, happens in Washington every single day. By everybody. In the State Department, on a given day, there would be official delegations, of course, the diplomats coming and going, but every single day there would be delegations from a civil society group, an organization concerned about a specific topic. It could be Uyghurs in China, it could be Christians in the Middle East, it could be Russian Jews, it could be whatever. Often it had to do with human rights, with an ethnic or religious minority, where they want to present their case, which they feel is not being represented by their government, right? This happens all the time. And I'm speaking from the American experience, but I know that this happens as well in Europe, whether it's civil society or pressure groups or exile groups and all of this. This is business as usual in the modern multipolar, decentralized diplomatic world. It's the way the world is. So if somebody in South Africa wants to put the genie back in the bottle, it's too late. That's not the way the world works.
I understand those attacks, though, from the South African government and their lackeys, because they've not been able to secure a meeting with the with the White House. But the Solidarity Movement and AfriForum did very quickly, and I mean, I think that's just down to the fact that we followed the correct channels. We built up this network of contacts, and we approached the United States and the Trump administration respectfully, not with an entitled sense of you need to meet with us because we're a big deal. Rather, we would love to meet with you. I think we have very valuable information and perspectives to share with you that will aid you as well in making sense about what's happening in South Africa. And I think that difference in approach really opened the door for AfriForum and has shut the door in the face of the South African government. They've now come out and said, oh, they're actually just taking their time. They haven't gotten a meeting because they don't think it's the right time now. As if in the middle of a crisis, it's not the absolutely perfect time to now go diffuse the situation in person.
Well, it would be better to diffuse the situation, but obviously I sympathize with them a little bit. Is that what's that old line? If you're digging a hole, stop digging, right?
Right.
And if they are going to engage to once again be disastrous, maybe it's better to be silent. But they need to be thinking about what you're saying. They need to be thinking about how do we engage with people with whom we disagree with, which, let's face it, right? That's a skill that you should have.
Especially as a diplomat. And I mean, at the end of the day, what you're describing there is what my grandfather always said. It's better to do nothing than to do something stupid.
Yeah.
So Alberto, that brings us now to the last topic, which is the least technical based and current events based. I just wanted to talk to you, share with us your journey as a diplomat. Where have you served? Where have you actually done work? Not where have you vacationed? Where have you been as an official diplomat? And what was your experience like? I mean, I think this will be a nice way to end the conversation, specifically painting that picture for us. From what experience are you talking to us here today?
Well, I had a 32-year experience in the U.S. diplomatic service. I'm Cuban American. I grew up in Miami, the exile capital of the Cuban people. I was born in Cuba. As a young man, as a teenager, in fact, I was interested in the Middle East. So I wanted to learn Arabic as a teenager. And I learned it. I joined the U.S. Army. I learned Arabic in the military. I got out, went to college, studied the Middle East in college, and then joined the diplomatic service out of the university. My first assignment was in the United Arab Emirates as a junior officer, third secretary. And then I went to the Dominican Republic because I have both Arabic and Spanish. So you'll see in my career, several times I've gone back and forth between the hemispheres. Where I was assistant cultural attaché in the Dominican Republic. And then I went to be press attaché in Nicaragua. Nicaragua, I don't know how much you know it, but I was there in its 15 minutes of fame. This is when Nicaragua was the center of the universe, very briefly. The New York Times had a Managua bureau. There were 250 foreign journalists there. This was the years of the Iran-Contra crisis and the Contras and the Sandinistas and the Reagan administration. And it was my first kind of trial by fire of working with the press. I was, 28 years old, and I was in charge of embassy. I was the embassy spokesman and in charge of press relations with a press corps which included every major media outlet in the world. And not just the Americans. There was like Pravda and, the Chinese and all of this stuff and everything. So that was a real trial by fire as a press officer. I found out that I was actually pretty good at it. I survived that experience. Then I went back to the Middle East. I went and was the public affairs officer in our embassy in Kuwait. And I was there until the day before the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. By chance, that was the date that my diplomatic mission was up in Kuwait. And my family and I, we left. We stopped in London. We went to our hotel, went to sleep, and we woke up, and there were Iraqi tanks on the street where we used to live. Then I was back in Washington, and then I deepened. I did an extra year of Arabic to make my Arabic even better. And then I went to Damascus in Syria. Syria very much in the news these days, which was one of my favorite assignments because
What year was that, Alberto?
that was in the 1990s. That was under the father, Hafiz al-Assad, because Syria is kind of one of the cultural capitals of the Arab world. And because I spoke Arabic, even though it's a dictatorship, there was a kind of rich cultural life that existed of intellectuals, of writers, of poets, of actors, and not just from Syria, but from other places in the Arab world. And as I said, that one of the most important things that a diplomat has to do is engage, right? To engage with your audiences. Well, it's a real pleasure when you engage with audiences that actually are interesting. And it's interesting to talk to political thinkers and writers, and especially if you know the language and you're interested in that. Then I went from from Syria to Guatemala in Central America, and it was a very interesting time. That's when the peace accords were arranged. The last war in Central America between leftist rebels and the government. I was there when that was arranged. Also a very interesting assignment, but just an interesting variation from Syria. Then from Guatemala back to the Middle East, to Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, which is one of our largest embassies. It's a small country with a very large embassy because we have a lot of relationships there, and so that was a great assignment. Then I finished in Jordan, and I went to Afghanistan. I was the first embassy spokesman based in Afghanistan after the liberation, after the Taliban fell. And that was a fascinating experience because when I arrived, the Marines were still living in the embassy. It had only been taken from the Taliban a few months before. And so it was very much a militarized situation. And I got to deal with kind of setting everything up. I mean, basically, when I got there, my office was myself and one Afghan guy who'd been in exile and me. And we had our computers together and fly swatters because there were flies flying around. And my job was to build an embassy, public affairs, press, culture, education section from scratch, which I did. That was a one-year assignment, and I enjoyed that. And then back to Washington. I began a job which had never existed before. From Washington, I became the spokesman of the U.S. government, of the State Department, in Arabic. So this is when there was the explosion of pan-Arab media. So I would go on and debate people on Al Jazeera in Arabic for an hour, which is insane that I did this. I mean, it's a very risky, dangerous thing. And actually, I got in trouble a few times. But I created a job which exists to this day. To this day, the State Department has an embassy, has an Arabic language spokesman who does the work that I pioneered 20 years ago. Then after a few more years in Washington, I got my first embassy. What I mean is the first embassy where I was the boss, which was Sudan. Incredible assignment. Sudan, of course, the largest country in Africa, a country that was South Sudan and Darfur at the same time. And a lot of people hate it. I loved my time in Sudan. Sudan is a fascinating place. People are very interesting. War, dictatorship, all of this stuff, a very colorful, fascinating situation. And my last overseas assignment was to be ambassador in a very small, very strange country, which has a South African connection, which is the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea, the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa, very rich, oil-rich country. Of course, it was the country of the so-called Wonga coup of Simon Mann and Mark Thatcher and Nick DeToit and all of this back in the day. And one of the things I did, he was a local. I got the last person who was involved in that plot out of prison when I was in Equatorial Guinea. So very interesting, kind of an African Qatar or an African Kuwait. So just a fascinating, enjoyable assignments, all of them very different. Probably my favorites were Syria and Sudan, just because of the nature of society and the nature of the work. In Sudan, it really was about war and peace and about trying to save lives and prevent civil war breaking out between the North and the South. So,
well, that's a fascinating and very impressive CV. I saw here people, even in the live, some of the live viewers as well, were expressing how impressed they were. Colonel says, "What a life! Absolutely fascinating. Thank you both." And Clive Malherbe says, "Really great guest with so much knowledge and experience. You should open up a school for future diplomats, especially for South Africans." Thank you, Ernst. And Emery says, "I must say, Mr. Fernandez is one of the most interesting guests on this channel so far." Well, thank you very much, everyone. Well, Alberto, that brings us to the end. I just wanted to ask you then the last question that I ask all my guests, and that is, if you were to leave the audience with something to think about this week or this year, in the months and days going forward, what would it be? It can be a thought, it can be a question, it can be a suggestion, anything. What would you implant at the back of their mind to chew on, maybe in the week ahead?
Well, I would say that it actually runs in diplomacy as well and runs in my career as well, is to be true to yourself and to your beliefs, your deeply held beliefs, but also try to understand and engage the other, right? We sometimes do one and not the other, right? We go with the other guy. We want to be liked. No, be faithful to yourself and to your cherished traditions and things, but also engage. That would be my thought.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time. I found this conversation absolutely incredibly insightful. And as I said, thank you for your insights. Again, during this fog of war time, where there's so much claims and narratives out there surrounding specifically this clash between the South African government and the Trump administration. But I think a lot of the principles that came to the fore in our conversation about this current event unfolding are actually principles that are eternal, things that will remain relevant into 2026, 2030, 2050. I think these principles of diplomacy will remain relevant to that part of the world and that part of human experience. So I thank you once again for your time.
Thank you, and I wish all the best, and you have all the solidarity and support from me and everyone I know with the great work of AfriForum.
Well, thank you very much. And then my last thing I just wanted to know is a little bit of admin, Alberto, and that is, if people are interested in your work, writing, or thoughts, is there any way they can find more of your ideas?
I am, like you, on Twitter. So,
all right.
You can find me there. That's the easiest way to find me.
I'll put a link in the description to your Twitter account, and then people can go follow you. Absolutely. And then lastly, just thank you to everyone that tuned in. Thank you for your comments and your questions. I know it's an orthodox time here in the afternoon here in South Africa, but I always try to make it work in regards to time zones with my guests. But thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you for sharing. And if you're new to this channel and you like these types of conversations, you can subscribe. And if you're watching and it's no longer live, you can still take part in the conversation by sharing your thoughts in the comment section. I read all of them and appreciate the feedback. Alberto, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, God bless you for the rest of your week and the year ahead. Just keep doing what you're doing, and thank you for the support.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers, guys. Have a good one, and God bless. Chat to you again real soon.